In 1982, a Boy Scout troop went for a weekend of camping at Mirror Lake in the Uinta Mountains of Utah. 19 people went. Only 18 came back. Daniel Harris was never heard from again, until 15 years later, allegedly. The story you're about to read is an account of the events that took place that fateful weekend, told by his best friend, Lucas Ford, in 1997. In an interview with a freelance journalist, Lucas, who was there the weekend Daniel disappeared, reported his disappearance to the scout leaders. There's no footage of Lucas, as he's adamantly refused to be interviewed on camera over the years. He has since fallen off the grid, most likely on purpose. He stated that this event has haunted him his entire life. Where do I even begin? What I'm going to tell you is exactly what happened. I've been called a liar, a killer, and every other name you can think of, but I don't really care. I know what took place that night and what I saw 15 years later. We arrived at Mirror Lake around 3 p.m. on Friday, June 11th. It was summertime, which meant we were out of school. We were 14 years old at the time and had been on multiple camping trips with the Boy Scouts, so we were excited to head to Mirror Lake, and summer vacation had just started. Danny and I, as his friends and family called him, both loved fishing, and Mirror Lake had great fishing. As soon as we arrived, we set up camp and pitched our tents. We weren't more than 100 yards from the lake, so we were fairly close, which we liked because we could easily walk to the lake to fish. Danny and I were sharing a tent, as we always did when camping with the scouts. There were 2 boys to a tent, and the leaders shared a tent. After we finished setting up our tent, we immediately grabbed our fishing gear and ran down to the lake. I remember that day well. The weather was perfect, and we ended up catching half a dozen fish before it got dark. When we made it back to camp around 7:30 or 8 p.m., we cooked and ate some of the fish we'd caught, saving the rest for the following day. Over the next hour or two, we all sat around the fire telling stories and laughing at each other's jokes. It was a great day, until we went to sleep. I'm not sure exactly what time it was when we went to bed, as I didn't have a watch and no one cares what time it is when you're camping. I remember it was late though, and I quickly fell asleep. The next thing I remember was being awakened by Danny unzipping the tent and saying he had to pee. I quickly fell back asleep and wasn't sure how long I'd been sleeping before I woke up to the cold night air hitting my face. I sat up and saw the tent door was still open. I called out to Danny in the darkness, but there was no answer. I called out several more times and again, no answer. At that point, I was starting to get scared, so I decided to go out of the tent and look for him. I had a shirt and shorts on, so all I needed to do was slip on my shoes and grab my flashlight. As I stepped out of the tent, I remember feeling a quiet eeriness, like I was being watched. I felt chills up my spine, and the hairs on my body stood on end. I started scanning the area around the tent and couldn't see him. I then walked around the tent about 10 yards away and called out to him again, this time louder. But again, no answer. I was starting to panic at that point and decided it was time to wake the leaders up and let them know. Their tent wasn't more than 20 yards away, so I walked over as fast as I could, looking behind my shoulder every step of the way. Once I woke them up and told them what was going on, they didn't waste any time getting up and out of the tent. They immediately started yelling out Danny's name, but like before, there was no response. They gathered us in a circle and explained that we were going to form a line and make a sweeping circle, searching the area for Danny. They instructed us not to get more than 10 yards apart and to make sure each person had a flashlight. We formed a long line and started walking slowly in a big circle, calling out Danny's name. Every few minutes or so, we'd stop to see if Danny would respond, but again, nothing. I wasn't sure how long we'd been searching when one of the other boys yelled out, "Hey, I found something! Get over here!" I'll never forget the panic in his voice. Everyone immediately ran to his position and looked down to where he was pointing. There, on the ground, was a small pool of blood. A minute went by without anyone saying anything. One of the leaders spoke first and said, this had to be the work of either a mountain lion or a bear. Another leader said it wasn't safe to continue searching in the dark. The plan was to wake up early, drive into town, get the sheriff, and search and rescue. But before going back to sleep, we all pulled our tents close together in a circle. I doubt anyone slept a wink that night. As soon as it was light enough, everyone piled into the cars, and we drove to the nearest town, Camas. We went straight to the sheriff's station and told them what had happened. A search and rescue party was quickly formed, and we all headed back to camp to help search for Danny. They even brought some hounds to track his scent. We made it back to camp about 2 hours later. When we got out of the car, the sheriff took me aside with one of his deputies and had me show and explain everything that took place the day before, starting from when we arrived at Mirror Lake. We then showed the sheriff, his deputies, and the search and rescue team where we'd found the small pool of blood. I vividly remember the hounds sniffing the blood and the ground around it, then suddenly taking off. We all took off following the hounds, yelling Danny's name as they led us through the thick forest of pine trees and aspens. We must have gone several miles through that thick forest, over ravines and steep mountains before finally coming to a river that was high and fast-moving. Unfortunately, there was no way anyone could cross it safely. It was there that the dogs lost Danny's scent. The sheriff then called everyone into a circle and said they were bringing up horses to widen the search. He instructed the scouts and leaders to head back to camp and stick around until they said we could leave. It took us a while to make it back to camp. As we emerged from the thick forest and our camp came into view, we could see just how many more people had arrived. A news van had even shown up, and they started running up to us as we approached the camp. Our leaders quickly got in front of us, so the reporters couldn't bombard us kids with questions. One of the main leaders of our scout troop decided to talk to the news reporter and simply give them the facts of what happened. Meanwhile, the other leaders moved us to a more secluded area so we could be alone. The rest of the day was pretty much a haze and seemed surreal. I remember people scurrying around camp all day, but I vividly remember Danny's parents arriving later. They were distraught and asked me a lot of questions, mostly about the events that unfolded and where I thought Danny might be. All I could do was repeat everything I'd said many times that day. I didn't know because I truly didn't know where my best friend was. I would have given anything to bring him back. I felt despair and emptiness that day and wondered what I could have done differently that night. I blamed myself for many years after that until I realized I was just a kid at the time, and there was nothing more I could have done. It's not as if someone can plan ahead and prepare for these things to happen. They searched for Danny for several weeks after that, but were never able to turn up anything. The search was eventually called off, and Danny was forever declared missing. His parents refused to declare him dead. The strangest and most unbelievable part of the story, though, took place just 15 years after Danny disappeared. I don't talk about it much, as most people don't believe me, but again, I don't care. I was there, and they were not. I'd been back to Mirror Lake several times after Danny disappeared to go fishing, but mostly to remember my best friend. The summer of 1997 was the last time I ever went back, and I'll never go back again. It was the last weekend of May, which meant there was still snow on the peaks of the mountains and the water was cold. This also meant there weren't a lot of people around. In fact, I don't recall anyone else being there that day. I always went back to the exact spot where Danny and I caught all those fish the day he disappeared. I arrived early in the morning around 6:30 a.m. Fishing is always better in the early morning. I unloaded my fishing gear, put some bait on my line, and cast it out. I always brought a camping chair when I went fishing, so I set it up, plopped down, and started drinking my coffee. I'm not sure how much time went by, but it wasn't long. I was about to take a sip of coffee when I heard from behind me, "Hello, Lucas." I immediately froze because, to my knowledge, there was no one else around. I slowly stood up and turned around. About 30 yards behind me stood a man I didn't recognize. He was extremely hairy from head to toe, wasn't wearing shoes, and had on worn, tattered clothes. I stood there for a bit, unable to speak. When I finally did, I said, "Who are you?" He stood there looking at me and finally replied, "It's me, Lucas. It's Danny." I remember a shot of horror and adrenaline flowing through my body. I stood there, frozen, unable to move a muscle. When I could muster up the words, I said, "Where have you been all these years?" Danny's next words haunt me to this day, and I think about them almost daily. I'll never forget. He said, "I was taken, and you must leave now. They're watching you. Leave now." After that, I didn't even think. As quickly as I could, I loaded up my gear, threw it into the back of my truck, jumped in, started the engine, and left as fast as I could. I looked in my rearview mirror as I drove away and saw Danny slowly walking back into the trees. As I drove towards town, I was torn about whether I should tell anyone or not. Who would believe me, right? I wasn't sure what happened was real either. It seemed too surreal. I didn't tell a single soul for several years after it happened, for two reasons. First, I knew no one would believe me. And second, I didn't want to go back there. If I told the authorities, they'd make me go back with them, or think I was crazy. Another reason is that Danny's parents were old and had come to terms with his disappearance. I couldn't stomach giving them hope and having them go through it all over again. I decided to wait until they passed. That's about all I have to say. I've never been back and never will. I don't know who they are or who he was referring to, but like I said, I think about it every day of my life. For more chilling horror stories, please subscribe. Thanks for watching.